Welcome, everyone. This is Strategies for Online Discussion Forums. My name is Paul Bepler, and I'm with my colleague Bill Brzaitis, and we're from the Center for Educational Innovation. In our previous video, we talked about 3 different strategies for discussion forums, and they were fairly basic strategies. We want to move on now to a couple of more complex strategies. The first one we want to talk about is the jigsaw. The jigsaw is a technique that may use both synchronous and asynchronous modalities. It is a technique that was developed in 1971 by Elliot Aronson, really in response to a need in Texas to work with desegregation. There were students who were not being treated equitably, and this technique was a response to that to make sure that all students could contribute to the learning in the classroom. So perhaps the best way to describe it is through an example. And if you look at the slide here, you see that there are 2 rounds, and in the first round, we have students divided into 4 different groups. Let's imagine that your content for the day was 4 different articles that they were to read. So what this allows us to do is to divide students into these 4 groups, A, B, C, and D, and each of these subgroups become an expert in a different article. So all of the students in group A read article 1, all the students in group B read article 2, et cetera, et cetera. These students then meet asynchronously and perhaps with a Google Doc, write down their main takeaways from the article. What are their talking points? What would they need to have written down so that they could teach this article to people who had not read that article? And so they would do this asynchronously. Maybe they would do it in a Canvas form, maybe a Google Doc. And at the end of that, they would have a sort of cheat sheet, a talking point sheet for the second round. In the second round, you would reshuffle the groups so that you would have one person who's an expert in each of the different articles in each group. So 4 heterogeneous groups with 4 different levels of expertise, 4 different expertises in 4 different articles. And this is the round that you might do synchronously, say in a Zoom session, put them into 4 breakout rooms, for instance, and then time them, say 6 or 7 minutes, to go through their talking points and teach to the others in their group what is in that Google Doc or had been in the Canvas form that were the main takeaways for the article. And then potentially after that, you as the instructor could potentially try to synthesize this, or that could be a task of another group altogether. So you could potentially do the second round in an asynchronous fashion. It might be a little bit more challenging to do the rounds. It might take a little bit more time. So you'd have to structure that pretty tightly as well. But this is a nice way to blend 2 different modalities to make sure that everyone is teaching each other and therefore that they're engaged and that you're keeping the notion that everybody has the same opportunity both to teach and to learn at the forefront of your pedagogy. In the next example, Bill's going to talk about another complex way to interact with students online.
Well, in this case, we're going to be talking about using asynchronous group postings. And they're somewhat similar to the jigsaw format that Paul talked about in that they encourage interaction and teamwork. But in this case, you would have groups of students, maybe 4 or 5 students, depending on the size of your class and your preferences, doing things like critiquing articles, research articles, for example, or working through case studies, or working through topics that require making recommendations, or perhaps they're doing various kinds of research. They're researching a topic and sharing the outcome of their research with other classmates. So it's really quite flexible. In some ways, these group posts are nice for students in that they encourage teamwork and interaction, but they also produce fewer posts in a bulletin board. So it's easier for students to actually read through classmates' posts, because instead of maybe 40 or 50 posts in a forum, you may have maybe half a dozen or 10, depending on the size of your class. So when you're thinking about these, I'll give you a few tips that we found to be useful. First of all, it's important with any assignment to consider the output and purpose. Ideally, these would be authentic assignments. That is something that's meaningful to students, and that's similar to the kinds of things, the kind of work that they're doing in class. They should also be complex enough that they require to be completed by a team. In other words, it's not just a simple activity with 4 people completing it, but something that really does require 4 people to complete. I've found that providing roles to students in this case is very, very useful, particularly the role of a project manager, because these students will be working largely asynchronously. You need somebody to sort of take the reins and make sure that there's a central Google folder that all of students' work will be in, that all students know how to communicate with each other, that deadlines are being set and enforced, and that communication is happening regularly. And that could be the responsibility of a project manager. I think other roles that you could consider would be things like an editor. That might be somebody who takes the written work of the group and polishes it prior to submitting the summary to the class or whatever output that you're asking them to do. Could be another role could be note taker or a resource provider and so forth. The last thing I want to mention is sort of how the instructor can make this easier for students. It's very important to be specific in your instructions to them and to include tips on not only the assignment and what's required, but tips on actually completing the work. As I've said, I found it really useful to have students work in Google Docs and maybe even communicate synchronously if necessary via Hangout or some other means as a way of completing this particular assignment. The final product then, the summary to the class that you see at the bottom of the slide, might be included in the Canvas discussion forum, but that doesn't mean that the preparatory work needs to be. There may be other tools that would be better suited to completing this particular task, and you should make them aware of it. I also, as I mentioned earlier, would highly recommend that you have roles assigned and communicate those to students in order to help them be more efficient and make the workload more equitable. So in these 2 videos, we've talked about structuring discussions. And in the next video, we're going to talk about the other element of making online discussion successful, namely moderating strategies and the ways in which you provide feedback. So we hope to see you there.